it is now pretty clear that Ukraine has been running an assassination campaign within Russia, because this comes a couple of weeks or 10 days or so after the killing of an important military engineer, Dr. Shitsky, who was developing new generations of cruise missiles for Russia. And there has been a bombing and subversion campaign since the summer of 2022. It's been rather more effective. No, I shouldn't say that. It's been more effective than the very spectacular psychological drone attacks on Moscow. But then, of course, the less advertised drone attacks have been doing an awful lot of damage in depth to Russian forces, to logistic bases and build-ups, so much so that they have slowed significantly, as we speak, the counterattack on Ukrainian forces in the Kursk pocket, which is not the kind of Christmas greeting that Mr. Putin wants.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Robert Fox. Robert is a journalist for more than 50 years, during which time he's covered conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East and the Falklands. He's also the author of multiple books and is currently defence editor for the London Standard. Robert, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline. Let's begin with the big news of the day, which is the killing of the Russian general Igor Kirillov, who's been accused by Ukraine of ordering the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian forces. First of all, what is your reaction to that news?
Well, it's interesting, the timing, because the Ukrainian authorities, the government, put down a charge on Monday that this man was accused by them of war crimes, of using exotic weapons, mostly chemical weapons, and they kill him within 24 hours. The circumstances of the assassination seemed quite bizarre, because he seemed curiously to have been unprotected, and curiously the Ukrainian special forces, their squads operating now, we must say, in metropolitan Russia, managed to find him very, very effectively. So there's something going on. The thing that we have to say before we come to the detail of him is it is now pretty clear that Ukraine has been running an assassination campaign within Russia, because this comes a couple of weeks or 10 days or so after the killing of an important military engineer, Dr. Shitsky, who was developing new generations of cruise missiles for Russia. And there has been a bombing and subversion campaign since the summer of 2022. It's been rather more effective. No, I shouldn't say that. It's been more effective than the very spectacular psychological drone attacks on Moscow. But then, of course, the less advertised drone attacks have been doing an awful lot of damage in depth to Russian forces, to logistic bases and build-ups, so much so that they have slowed significantly, as we speak, the counterattack on Ukrainian forces in the Kursk pocket, which is not the kind of Christmas greeting that Mr. Putin wants.
Indeed, and we should say the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, has told Reuters that its agents have carried out the assassination. How will Vladimir Putin be reacting? Because this is very close to home to him, both in terms of how close Kirillov was to him, but also this assassination was carried out pretty close to the Kremlin.
Within 4 miles of the Kremlin, in a suburb in Moscow, I think southeast Moscow. And as I was alluding, he was remarkably unprotected. The bomb, about 300 grams of highly sophisticated explosive, was attached to the seat, the saddle of a motor scooter at the entrance to the apartment block in which he lived. He was passing by with his assistant, and it made a very big hole. But how relatively unprotected he was, and this is relevant to Putin himself, who is absolutely paranoid about personal security, and he will be going privately absolutely mad about this. he will come up with, I think, within hours, as we are recording, of a blood-curdling threat that he will consider this, that, and the other, bringing the earth down. And, of course, he will, cheapening the currency yet again, he will mention nuclear, tactical nuclear, without a shadow of doubt. But that will throw the spotlight back on Kirillov. What was he really up to? And I think that this is where the Ukrainians have made a very powerful information war point, propaganda, in saying the Russians are playing dirty with the risks of a really dirty outcome of attacking or causing an ecological disaster from one of the main nuclear power generation plants within Ukraine, particularly the Zaporizhia plant, which is one of the biggest complexes in the world, if not the biggest. But there are 3, 4, or 5 other ones as well, and the Ukrainians are well aware of it. It's very interesting how the campaign is emerging, because Russia is still going for crude tactics. That is their advantage in weight and in number, in munitions and manpower in particular. I think we're beginning to see the Ukrainians fighting quite, I was about to say quite successfully, but more successfully than the commentariat would have, the general commentary in the media of the West, particularly the English language press from America and UK, particularly America and in Germany, of course, because they've been trying to hint, in Germany, for obvious reasons. I don't want to add an extra ingredient, extra currant to the current bun, as it were, but it is spectacular in that appeasement of Russia seems to be very much on the cards in the now launched election campaign for February in Germany. What I think is clever is that just reading, listening across the airwaves, and particularly in social media, how well prepared the Ukrainians are for this, that they knew all this was coming, and they're maneuvering. I think they're maneuvering as they always have done. They're quite in a clannish, even gangster culture. They're not telling an awful lot to an awful lot of their allies. They're not showing their hand, because they know jolly well that would go out and get into the hands of the Russians anyway. I think, as we speak, and we must come back to Kirillov, of course, is Russia is in a very bad place. It's not defeated, but it is in a very bad place when you consider this propaganda blow, that in fact the big counteroffensive, despite the massive numbers, is not going as well as it should have done, and Syria.
Well, some really interesting points there, and we'll come back to a lot of them in due course. Just on Kirillov, to kind of round this off, interesting that you say, Robert, that you think this is part of a wider campaign of assassinations. What do you think the scope of that is? And, the paranoia that Vladimir Putin will be feeling about his own security, do you really think that within Ukraine that they would even be countenancing potential attempts on Vladimir Putin's life, or would they see that as a step too far? What is your reading on that?
I think it's a step too far, James, because it's unrealistic. It would not be worth the effort. It would lead to dreadful consequences. I think that if there was a main attempt, rather like the attempted assassination of Hitler in, the July plot in 1944, that there would be an awful lot of innocence damaged on the way. And I think that Zelensky, but particularly Budanov and the others, who are very, very well aware of the great marsh of public opinion and global opinion, which is still broadly in the developed world, not the same in the South, but broadly sympathetic. They won't want to alienate that. And golly, just the investment by Putin in manpower and money in his own protection. No, they're going to try and unbalance him. And I think they're doing quite a good job. And that's where we have to read it back. I was just trying to recall, you may remember that Putin's great propagandist was Alexander Dugin, and they tried to kill him in August 2022, within 6 months of the war beginning. And they got the wrong target. They got his car and they killed his daughter, Daria. But that was the sign. That was the first indication that there really was a sophisticated assassination campaign, and it's gone on. And I said the last one before Kirillov was the killing of Mikhail Shatsky, who was shot in woods. So their intelligence, one must say, that the subversion squads of the security service, and it's not mainstream military of Kiev, their intelligence is really pretty good. They know where people are, in other words. Yeah.
But do you think Ukraine, if they wanted to, they have the capability to take out Putin?
It's very difficult because I don't know how much they're prepared to invest in it. But let me put it like this, to use the cheap currency of military planning, and it's a term not necessarily beloved, but you have to work out what the center of gravity is. And is Putin the center of gravity? That's what they will be asking at the highest level of command. This is what Sirsky will be asking. I mean, the center of gravity, that it was unconditional surrender, take Berlin, and the Allies agreed on that. The big three: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Or as Leonard Cohen had it, first we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin. The Berlin is the objective. The objective is the defeat or the retreat of Moscow and the unwillingness of the military machine to continue. It's not necessarily Putin himself. If they can drive him mad, which they can make it a fairly good effort at, they'll continue to do that. But what they've got to do is to wear that machine down at the edges. It's very interesting that they're not running, because it's very difficult to do, they're not running an in-depth psychological war against potential recruits. They know full well, and Zelensky, as a performer in Moscow, where he was very successful in the media world, knows that Russian patriotism is absolutely solid. The terrible war from 41 to 45 is still the great patriotic war, and they still are solidly behind Putin, because Putin is very successful in a way that is quite difficult to understand in the freewheeling West, is the embodiment of Russia. He says it himself. He talks about Russia, the Russian soul. It's almost, we're back to the world of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, but he really means it. And it really means something to the majority of Russians. Now, the Ukrainians fully understand that. They understand their own sense of nationhood. The train has left the station. They're moving to the West to be an open, pluralistic, Western liberal democracy in their own terms. And it will be their own terms because they're nowhere near the destination yet. But this is the real division. And so far, they are succeeding in a way that Putin and his entourage never expected. Let's go back to February 2022. They really did expect to get the job done within a fortnight. Get Zelensky out, a puppet government in, a bit of fighting would go on here and there, but they did go into Ukraine, some of the units with their ceremonial uniforms for the victory parade in Kiev, through Maidan Square, and with a puppet, a Lukashenko possibly kind of figure, to take over from Zelensky. Belarus and what they're doing in Georgia was the model, and it's a long way away.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode of Frontline. Don't forget, you can also now listen to Frontline in podcast form. Just search for The World in 10 from wherever you get your podcasts, where you can also hear daily analysis of the biggest stories relating to war and defence. And we'll put a link to The World in 10 in the description below. Just wanted to pick up, Robert, on something you said earlier about Ukraine being far better prepared for this phase of the war than many commentators in the West give them credit for. Can you expand on that? Because there is this narrative that Russia is in a stronger position at the moment. They continue to make incremental gains in the east. They've been bolstered by foreign troops from Africa and the Middle East and North Korea. That's the narrative. Why do you think that is simplistic?
It's a race to reach the culmination point where they can't go any further. The Russian losses have been colossal. They can absorb them. But it's when you match the losses in personnel with material, and come around the spring, we will get a really good look into this in April, and I think the crisis point could be hit by June, because they cannot produce guns, barrels, particularly for tanks and medium and heavy artillery, at the rate that they really need to. How much they can draw on material from North Korea, to an extent, missiles and drones to an extent, with Iran, but Iran is in shock from what has happened serially, from the defeat of Hezbollah, the bombing raids of late October, which seem to have raised a huge question about their own Russian air defenses, S-300 primarily, and then Syria. So Iran is not in a good place as far as Russia is concerned, and can't really help all that much. How much they could go on with North Korea, particularly as the performance so far recognized, and it may be over gilded by Ukrainian propaganda, but the performance of the North Korean troops, which we were told were very well trained and crack troops, even by people from the Royal United Services Institute, has not been good. The expression from the Korean War of 50-53 that keeps coming back is the human wave, which the Chinese did, and a terrible slaughter, and it didn't deliver victory. At the very end of that campaign, we saw human waves again, awful, tragic, pathetic, in the Iran-Iraq war, where these teenagers with charms and Qurans around their neck were just thrown into the slaughter. Well, it appears that the same thing is happening now, particularly around Kursk. Russia is making gains, but I would question, having looked at some analysis by Professor Phillips O'Brien of St Andrews University, and by the Institute, the Kagan Institute for the Study of War, which gives very accurate, precise depictions by the day. They're not getting there to critical culminating points, desired culminating points. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin, the pinpoints that they really needed to take by Christmas. And there are places like Pokrovsk now, investing, in other words, completely surrounding and taking off the board Zaporizhia, and they're making claims to Kherson. As they get more frustrated, their claims are getting more exaggerated. And the latest, as we are speaking, within the last 24 hours, which came up from Putin's people and Lavrov, the foreign minister, is that they are demanding not only Luhansk and Donetsk, but Zaporizhia Oblast and Kherson. There's not a chance of that happening by the time Trump takes the White House around or on January the 20th.
And the point about material is really interesting, because so often when we talk about it, we focus from a Ukrainian perspective, and it's undeniable that Ukraine have suffered from supply issues in part because of the delays in Western military aid. But you do now have Ukraine's military industrial base starting to really ramp up. You have huge production now of drones in Ukraine, and indeed, the Pivdenmash facility in Dnipro, which was targeted by the Oreshnik missile, that is really the headquarters of the Ukrainian ballistic missile program that is ramping up as well. And is that something you think is under commented on, Robert?
Well, to pull back again, and again, it's commentators like Phillips O'Brien who are looking at it. I'm going to answer your question by saying what is not happening. Russia has been highly effective and seemed to be gaining a decisive advantage in the air. That's not happening now. They have not got total air control. What's going on here? Yes, they are launching the glide bombs still. They are devastating attacks. They have 100 plus drone with Iskander missiles thrown in, attacks on the infrastructure. That's going to go on for a bit. But they are fewer in number. So is it that the counterstrikes by Ukraine are more effective? Have they used ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp more effectively? I'm pretty sure, and I haven't looked at the operational analysis there or got any that is really precisely credible. But I think that's how they've slowed things around Kursk. And they're causing an awful lot of damage here and there. I mean, we're not flagging it up much, but they're smashing up Crimea still. It's almost going to be a price that's really not worth holding on to for Putin, and everything's going on there. They lost 2 of their ghost tankers. And was that sabotage? It was in the Strait of Kerch, in the Sea of Azov. Target area again. I think that they're looking after they're preserving their resources, harboring up their resources, because they know this is the Ukrainians, there won't be a big flow of arms. And Biden is pushing quite a lot in, and they've got to build it themselves. And what they're doing, and they're saying to the Western powers in NATO, the Western European powers, if you're not going to help us, we're going to do it ourselves with our allies, the Finns, but above all, the Poles. And that's your point, James. They are building a very handy defense industry. They were always very good at it, but they are projecting within weeks, months, possibly, but weeks it could be, Ukraine will be turning out more drones than the rest of NATO put together, including Poland, including the United States.
How bad have the last few weeks been for Vladimir Putin, Robert? Not only with now the assassination of Kirillov, but also what you mentioned in Syria and the wider impact that has had on Russian prestige, not only because Bashar al-Assad, who Putin had been propping up for 10 years, has now fallen and Russia wasn't able in the end to keep him in power, but also, as you say, how Iran will now be looking at Russia thinking, well, actually, you talk a big game, but your air defences have failed. Can we actually believe in your credibility?
Yeah, well, let's take Iran. That attack, as revealed by the Chief of Defence Staff, Tony Radakin, in his annual speech, end of the year speech, is Israel put out 100 aircraft, including, I think, supporters and tankers, such that they have. They fired about 100 projectiles only. And most of them, it's all in 100s, from about 100 kilometers or 100 miles off. And they got the centers. This is what the Americans persuaded them not to do anything silly to try and take out the nuclear facilities, because they probably wouldn't get most of them. They're so well concealed. But they got them, and not one of those aircraft were lost. So what has the S-300 and the S-400, which was supposed to be super effective, top of the range, so much so that a NATO ally, namely Turkey, bought them. Are they really that good? And just a little footnote to that, this is really nerdy. Of course, the best civil intelligence, open source, on Syria has been that the Russians have been trying to ship out the S-400 apparatus from Khmeimim, the main airbase near Latakia, and that has been a priority. And while the Russians are trying to hang on in there, and the whys and wherefores we can discuss in a second, is that they seem to be very, very worried about the best of their kit getting into the wrong hands. So it is all looking very strange. And by the way, it gives very broad conclusion on Ukraine is this is where sanctions appear to have worked. Where is the Russian Air Force? Because the one thing that the Ukrainians are doing is that they are driving the aircraft further and further back, and that is why they are relieved that the glide bomb, which is a sort of air-launched primitive cruise, wings on old dumb bombs, but with guidance system, they're driving them further back. Now, if they can attack with their own weaponry in depth and get the airfields south, east, and east of Moscow, then that is really going to be a big change. And that throws into question, as you say, how much, two things, how much of a defeat is it and how much will it affect the rest of the picture for Russia in Syria? And I would say currently it is very big because they're scared witless about losing effectively their naval base at Tartus, means they can't support their new naval facility in Benghazi, and even in the Red Sea, where they have been working with the Iranians and helping in the development of a new military port at Port Sudan. All that goes. And that at the moment they're bargaining with HTS, the insurgents, that can we stay on? Oh, we'll be your pals. And it's just to keep the presence. But the other thing is you have to look at the whole, the ghost in the machine that didn't appear, is it shows you how the whole employment of Wagner, we know reconstituted Wagner is present. They're being used in Sudan, used in Libya, used in Mali and places like that. But they're nowhere near as effective as they were under Prigozhin. Big problem for a wider foreign policy, aggressive foreign policy for Putin. Now, what does he do? He is unlikely, therefore, to accommodate Trump. Everybody has been looking and quoting this thing, I can fix the war in 24 hours. Once I become president, it will be a priority. Full stop. For Trump and Trumpland, fixing Ukraine will not be a priority. He's got too much on his plate with migration, tariffs, China. And the other thing, I'm sorry to quote, because it had a very good run of blogs and broadcasts. Phillips O'Brien has written an article over the weekend saying, peace in Ukraine may not be Trump's gift to give. Because if the Ukrainians don't like it, if he says you've got to give up all this slew of 6 oblasts that Lavrov and Putin are claiming, they're going to say no, and we don't care what the Germans are saying. We're strong enough with our alliance that it's going to be very difficult. But before we conclude, I've been talking about war, and jaw. The real problem and the most effective area of activity for Putin is information disinformation. And that's what I think we're still not looking at nearly enough. It's just the depth of falsehood, disinformation, disorientation, very well thought out psychological warfare from Putin. It's pervasive in Ukraine. But the very good example is this, and I don't know who's right, who's wrong, and who did what. Look at the presidential election in Romania. We're going to have a lot more of that. It's going to be a very confusing time. It's very interesting coming back to the UK. I think the UK, the Starmer government, only now, obviously being preoccupied, is beginning to realise that. And I think we're going to get a very different approach in the new year, a very different approach to security, strategy, and defence. I think they'll have to rethink the defence review in view of the scenario I had just painted, and it can't be allowed for Rachel from accounts, as the military call her, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel from the accounts, saying her equivalent of yet, I've got no money, defence isn't important to me, because there is a turn in public opinion. Defence may not be important to Rachel and the accounts department. It's very important to a lot of people in the country now.
Well, just briefly to round things off, is it your view that the kind of collective wisdom, if you want to call it that, and more often than not, the collective wisdom on anything is wrong, the collective wisdom that you hear at the moment, which is that, 2025, Trump will come in, he'll initiate peace talks. Those peace talks may lead to a settlement that is more favourable to Vladimir Putin, etc., etc. Do you think that is fundamentally wrong? And we will see a situation in which, come the summer of 2025, the war in Ukraine is very much still ongoing, but that things may be far more favourable to the Ukrainians and the Russians?
I think it's very simplistic, James, to say that. I think there will be talks, there will be negotiations, and there will be pressure from whoever comes in Germany, because I think the coalition will be pro peace in Ukraine and whatever happens in France. That's why what Britain and the Northern powers, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which has its summit on the 18th of this month, will become significant, more significant than people realized. It's going to be fascinating, by the way, since we've got a UK audience, that the Starmer speech on foreign policy at the Mansion House, I'm between Europe and Trump's America. I want to be friends with everybody. That's not going to wash. I think there is a new realism. I think what the Starmer government may have miscalculated is the gritty, rather grim, realistic, smiling pessimist, or the what is it? The pessimism of the intellect, the optimism of the soul, or whatever it was that Gramsci said. What I'm finding, despite great difficulties right across the piece, amongst some military leaders in this country, there's some real thinking going on. And that, by the way, is with military leaders who've had a lot of experience of Ukraine.
Robert, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.